anyone ever heard of a 71-year-old Russian Orthodox priest, artist and adventurer by the name of Fyodor Konyakov? Well, that's great, because that means that everyone's going to learn something today. And I've got to say that I was blissfully unaware of the existence of Mr. Konyakov until late May in 2014. At that time, I was working for the Sunshine Coast Regional Council, which is like a county, I suppose, about halfway up the east coast of Australia. And my role at council, I was in charge of growing the economy through tourism and sport. We had other people who were growing the economy through agriculture and aviation and health services, but I had the fun, sexy portfolio of tourism and sport. And I went into work one Monday morning, as I said, late May 2014, just as normal. We had a staff meeting. I answered a few emails and made a few phone calls. And then mid-morning, I went out and I made myself a coffee, grabbed a local paper, went back to my office, and I was reading through the paper. And on pages 4 and 5, there was a story, a feature story about a Russian who was attempting to become the very first man to row all the way across the world's largest ocean, the Pacific. And if he succeeded, it would be the longest solo man-powered voyage in history. I'll say that again, in history. And the article went on to say that he was making for our local beach, Mooloolaba Beach, and that if everything went to plan, he would arrive sometime later in the week. And I was gobsmacked. I mean, I prided myself on having the best network of contacts anywhere on the coast, and I knew about things before they happened, and this was the first time that I'd heard about this. And this, just then the phone rang, and it was the CEO of the council, and who was several heads on the totem pole of power above me. And he said, "Have you read this story about the Russian rower?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm just reading it now." And he said, "Okay, I want you to handle it." And I said, "Handle it?" And his exact words were, "Just do whatever it is that you do." And I had the reputation at the time of being someone who could see an opportunity that others may not see, or take an opportunity and leverage it and make it much bigger and more successful than it would normally be. And that's what he wanted me to do. And I thought, this is great, a fun little project to have for a while. And so the first thing I did is I rang the journalist who had written the story, who I knew quite well, and I said, "Where did you get this from?" And he said, "It's a great story, isn't it?" The Russian son, Oscar Konyakov, arrived on the coast the previous Friday with some support crew, and he had rung the newspaper and given them the story. And the journalist said, "Jeff, I was actually going to give you a call because Oscar needs help, and I thought you'd be the best person to help him." And so he gave me Oscar's contact details, and for the very first time, which is now many, many times, I rang Oscar Konyakov. Lovely guy, speaks English very well. And I explained to him that I was ringing him to give him a hand, and he was very, very grateful to hear from me. I mean, in Australia, we have 3 levels of government: federal, state, and local, which is at least one too many, in my opinion, but that's another story. And he didn't know who to ring in which department of which level of government. So he was really happy to hear from me. And I said, "Okay, well, we better get together and have a chat." And I said, "Do you know where the yacht club is at Mooloolaba?" And he said, "But of course." Because Russians don't say yes, they say, "But of course." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll meet you down there in half an hour." And I did a few more things around the office and then jumped in the car and went down to the yacht club, which features fairly heavily in this story. And as I said, he's a lovely guy, and I asked him what sort of help he needed. And the first thing he said was that this boat that his father was rowing was very low profile, very close to the sea level. They were concerned about crossing the very busy shipping lanes just off the coast. And I said, "No problems. I know the Commodore of the local volunteer Coast Guard. They've got a brand new 60-foot bright yellow boat. They'd be happy to escort him across those shipping lanes. They love playing with their boat." And the other issue was that he said that this was part of a world record attempt, and that the people from the Guinness Book of Records and the International Rowing Federation were on the coast to certify the record. But if anyone actually touched the boat before it made landfall, that could put the record in jeopardy. So I said, "No problem, we get some rubber duckies, the inflatable rescue boats from the local surf life-saving clubs, and if necessary, we'll put a cordon around the boat so no one can go near it." And there was a couple other little things, but then he really surprised me. he said that because of the adventures that his father had done in the past, he was considered a national hero in Russia. In fact, he holds the status of living national treasure. And because of that, there was a 3-person news crew from Moscow who was on the coast as well. They needed some help, and the producer was on her way down to have a chat. And he also said that the Russian ambassador to Australia was going to be flying in on Thursday to read a personal, handwritten letter of congratulations from President Vladimir Putin, which I know is not the flavour of the month right now. But this surprised me because I hadn't considered for a second that this guy might have done something else in the past. So I made a mental note that I'd do some research when I got back to the office. And then the journalist came down. And I mean, even with that Russian ambassador, I mean, the Sunshine Coast is a fairly low-key, family sort of place. We don't get ambassadors from countries like Russia. So I knew I'd have to put some protocols into place and let some people know. But the producer from the 3-person TV crew came down. Her name was Ivana, and she wanted some help. She said that they had to get this footage back to Moscow as soon as possible after he landed. And I said, no problem. I know the people at Channel 7. I'll take you up there straight after this meeting, introduce you. They'd be happy to help. But I thought, this is the opportunity I've been looking for to promote this more. And I said to her, is that the only story while you're doing here on the coast, or do you want to do other stories as well? And she said, but of course, but we don't know what else to do. And so I rang up a friend of mine, Terry Irwin. Does everyone know the widow of the crocodile hunter? Okay. Well, Australia Zoo is located on the Sunshine Coast, so Terry and I have done a lot of projects together over the years. I rang her and told her what was going on. She said, yep, send them out. So they went out that afternoon, they did an interview with Terry, and then they did the usual sort of things like cuddle a koala and feed a kangaroo, and the reporter was involved in the croc show in the Crocoseum, the main stadium there they've got out there. And then the next day, we've got a huge aquarium at Mooloolaba as well called Underwater World, where you can go diving with the sharks there. And I said to Ivana, I thought it'd be a good story if we put the reporter in the shark tank. She thought it was a great idea. The reporter, well, not so much. He wasn't quite as enthusiastic. He'd actually never seen a shark in real life before. These were very big sharks. He'd seen all the movies though, and he was absolutely convinced he was going to be ripped to shreds by these sharks. He had to be ordered to do it by Ivana. I thought it was really funny because, I mean, he had to do a piece to camera beforehand. He was shaking so much, I thought he was going to take out his teeth with the microphone. They gave him a brand new wetsuit to wear, and he almost wore out the zip because he kept on having to go to the toilet every couple of minutes. He was so nervous. He rang his wife and woke her up at 2 o'clock in the morning in Moscow to tell her that he loved her, which I thought was lovely. And then the next day, we went to one of the local beaches and did a mock surf carnival where he was taken out to sea in a rubber ducky and dumped in the water. And this big, muscly lifeguard paddled out on a rescue board and put him on the front of the rescue board, and they made their way back to shore. And as they got closer, they surfed down this wave all the way to the shore, made fantastic television. And then when he was on the beach, this gorgeous lifesaver in bikini started simulating giving him mouth to mouth. He was having a much better day than the day before. And every evening we would take that back to Channel 7, they would edit it and they would send it back to Moscow. And it was played on their news system, and more than 100 million Russians were seeing all these wonderful images of the Sunshine Coast and learning about it for the very first time. So the CEO of the council was very happy with me. It exceeded all expectations, and I was pretty happy. But back to that first meeting with Oscar, there was something that was going to confuse me. I mean, if I was going to make history by being the first person to row all the way across the Pacific Ocean, I'd be rowing into Sydney Harbour and pulling up on the steps of the Opera House and making a big deal of it. Or I'd row to Byron Bay, which is the easternmost part of Australia, and save myself a couple of 100 miles of rowing. Why would you come? I mean, it's a beautiful place. This is Mooloolaba Beach, where he actually landed, one of our nicest beaches there. But I mean, if you're going to come, why would you come to the Sunshine Coast? And Oscar explained that there was two main reasons. And the first one was that the famous Humboldt Current, which comes all the way across the Pacific, finishes up somewhere near the Sunshine Coast. But the main reason was that this boat, this state-of-the-art carbon fibre boat, was built in England. And part of the deal with the boat builder was that if Fedor made it to Australia, they'd ship the boat back to England, and that boat builder could use that boat to promote his business and his expertise at different boat shows and trade shows across England for a year. And that boat builder had a brother who had emigrated to Australia, lived on the Sunshine Coast. They talked to each other, and the boat builder asked his brother, if this crazy Russian actually makes it, can you help with the logistics of sending the boat back? And the brother said, yep, but it'd be better for me, easier for me if they came here. I could send it back from here. So Fedor and Oscar looked over charts and they said, well, that's as good a place as any. And they decided to come to the Sunshine Coast, which is, sliding doors. That's how I got involved in all this. So it was pretty good. But so Oscar and I decided that we'd keep in contact during the week. We'd do some media together to promote what was going on. And I went back to the office and I thought, okay, well, I've got to do some research and find out more about this guy. So who is he? He was born December 12th, 1951, so in 3 weeks' time he'll be 72 years old. He was born on the coast of the Sea of Azov, which is part of the Black Sea. Used to be part of Ukraine, and hopefully it will be again sometime soon. At the age of 15, his father was a fisherman. At the age of 15, he borrowed one of his father's rowboats and he rowed across the Black Sea, as you do. And then at the age of 18, he was conscripted into the Soviet Navy, and after his initial training, he was selected for Special Forces training. And his role was to smuggle munitions, arms and ammunition, down from Siberia, down past Japan, through the American naval blockade of North Vietnam to supply these weapons to the North Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War. Now, after 2.5 years of service in the Navy, his conscription was up, and the things that he had seen had traumatized him so much that he did a full 180-degree career turn, and he enlisted in art school. He wanted to become an artist. And then in 77, 78 and 79, they did a recreation of the famous Russian Admiral Vitus Bering's overland trip across Siberia and then out into the Bering Sea to discover Alaska for the first time. And then in 83, he put himself forward, volunteered for a rafting expedition, and he rejected. And it was only at the 11th hour someone pulled out and they let him go. And this was a rafting down the Lena River in Siberia. Now, we travel a lot, but I've never been to Siberia. I heard it can get quite chilly there. This is 3 months living on an open raft, sleeping on the banks of this river, and it was all about studying the Siberian tiger and its environment. And now Fedor is recognised as the world's leading expert on the Siberian tiger. 2 years later, they repeated the expedition to learn more about the Siberian tiger, this time on foot and on horseback, and again on a raft. And then he did a ski expedition to the Pole of Inaccessibility. Now, this was a Russian team that did, a 12-person team that did this, and I'll explain the Pole of Inaccessibility. It is a geographical location located somewhere in the world that changes all the time, but in the Northern Hemisphere winter, it's always on a part of the Arctic ice flows, and it is the point on Earth that is furthest away from any sort of support or civilization whatsoever. And this was a 3-month trip out there, or 38 days trip out there, and if you talk to Fedor and you ask him which of his adventures he would not want to do again, this is the one he'd talk about, because this was awful. This is Siberia, so the Arctic winter, pitch dark. They only had the lights on their helmets. They had to crawl over fissures in the ice. They had to be very careful of the hidden crevasses and things. On one occasion, they disturbed a hibernating polar bear, so it was very dangerous. It was very, very difficult trip. Halfway through, half the team wanted to pull out and quit, and the other half, including Fedor, wanted to keep going. There was lots of arguments and dissent amongst it, so it wasn't a very nice trip at all, but eventually they made it. But after that, Fedor decided that if he was going to do adventures, he wanted to do them alone, so he didn't have this hassle again. And then he was part of a Russian-Canadian team to ski to the North Pole, which took 52 days. And then he did a unsupported trek to the walk to the North Pole, which took 63 days. And in 1989, the same year, he was leader of a Russian-American bicycle crossing of Russia. Now, this was the height of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan talking about the evil empire, etc. And this was supposed to generate friendship between the two countries, the two people who were at conflict with each other, Russia and America, promote friendship, which is a wonderful sentiment. I think that's great. I just don't know how friendly I would be after 131 days on a bicycle seat. But and then he did his first solo ski to the North Pole. Now, it's easy to put this up on a screen and say, well, that's what he did. But can you imagine all the work involved in that, all the training that we'd have to do for that? Just absolutely incredible. And then he became the first Russian to complete a solo, non-stop circumnavigation of the world in a yacht. And just keep your eye on the different disciplines we're talking about here, all the different modes of transport. But wait, there's more. In 1991, he was part of a Russian-Australian 4x4 crossing of the Soviet Union. And this was part of a 60 minutes television program showing people the Soviet Union. And it's famous because they actually started in the Soviet Union, but they ended up in the Russian Federation because while they were traveling, the Soviet Union broke up. Really interesting program if you get to see it. In 1992, he did his first successful summiting of Mount Everest. And once again, it's easy to put that up there and say, well, that's what he did. But can you imagine how hard that is to do? Then he was captain of the Round the World Yacht Expedition, taking 508 days. He did another solo, unsupported trek to the South Pole this time, just taking all his own gear with him and walking to the South Pole. In 1997, he achieved the 7 summits, which was to summit the highest peak on every continent. And then he did another international around the world trip on a yacht. And then in 2000, he completed the Iditarod race in Alaska, 1,150 miles. And we were in Alaska last year. We spoke to the organisers of Iditarod. They still remember Fedor. Because of that last expedition finished later than expected, he had no training. He had to borrow a sled and also a sled dog team. Had very, very little training. The winner of that race finished in just over 7 days. Fedor took 15 days, and people pulled out in front of him, but he kept going. So he eventually won the Red Lantern Award. He was last, but he became the most persistent of the trekkers, and he's very well regarded by the organisers. And then he did another solo non-stop around the world yacht race. And then he rode a camel along the Great Silk Road, as you do, including the only recorded ever solo crossing of the Danakil Desert in Ethiopia, something that's never really been done before. And then he set a new world record by rowing solo across the Atlantic Ocean, taking 46 days. And he also set some more records along with Tony Bullimore, who's a Brit, in catamaran and trimaran racing. But wait, there's more. In 2005, he completed his 4th solo circumnavigation of the world in a yacht, and then he became the very first person to win the Antarctica Cup, or sail solo around Antarctica. And I think this needs a little bit more explanation because this is absolutely incredible. Like I said, the very first person to do it. This is a map of the United States superimposed over the continent of Antarctica. So Antarctica is almost twice the size of the United States. And around that continent, you've got those ice flows. And around those ice flows, you've got the most savage oceans anywhere in the world. As I said, he became the very first person to be able to sail all the way, do a circumnavigation of Antarctica. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now, I know that a lot of you are thinking, well, that's a pretty good effort, but you're a tough audience, and you can probably see that there's some gaps in those dates. I've actually only put up around about 2/3 of the things that he did. I don't want to, I haven't got enough time to go through them all for a start, but I also don't want to bore you with too much PowerPoint. But while he was doing all those, he was also studying and doing the exams, and in 2010 he was ordained as a Russian Orthodox priest. Incredible. But wait, there's more. In 2012, he summited Everest for the second time. Absolutely crazy. And then he did a sled dog expedition from the geographical North Pole down to Canada. He is only the third person to ever live to achieve the Explorer's Grand Slam, which is to summit the highest peak on every continent, walk to the North Pole, walk to the South Pole. He is the only person who has ever lived on this planet, ever, who has reached the 5 extreme poles on Earth, and that is walking to the North Pole, walking to the South Pole, the pole of inaccessibility, which I talked about before, the top of Mount Everest, which he's done twice, which is considered to be the mountaineer's pole, and going solo around Cape Horn, which is considered to be the yachtsman's pole as well. But wait, there's more. He's also an accomplished artist with more than 3,000 works of arts and sculptures in museums and art galleries around the world, and most of these relate to the adventures that he's been on. He was the youngest person admitted to the Soviet Art Union of Artists, and he's a gold medalist in their Arts Academy as well. But in 1998, he was also put into the United Nations Environment Programme Global 500. He was their laureate for that year. These are the 500 people in the world that have the most influence over the telling people about the environment. And he joined people like Sir David Attenborough, Sir Edmund Hillary, Jacques Cousteau, Jimmy Carter, Robert Redford, Jane Goodall, Greenpeace International, and he's still a member of that very austere organisation. But this was a voyage across the Pacific, the longest solo man-powered voyage in history. He left Concon in Chile just before Christmas in 2013, and he was rowing across the Pacific. Now, when we had that first meeting with Oscar, we said that we'd keep in touch and we'd do some media through the week and everything. And I asked him, when are you expecting your dad? And he said, well, if everything goes according to plan, he could be here Friday or Saturday. And then on the Tuesday, Oscar phoned me and he said, well, it won't be Friday, it could be Saturday, more likely Sunday. And then on the Wednesday he phoned and it said, well, it might be Sunday, but more likely Monday. Conditions have got choppy out there. The Humboldt current has weakened as he's got closer. He's tired. And then on the Thursday, he rang me and he said, well, it could be Sunday, but much more likely Monday. But I said, doesn't matter, we've got everything organised, everything's in place, didn't really matter. And then on the Friday morning, he rang me and he said, Jeff, it's going to be tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. What? What's happened? And he said, he's got following wind, following seas, he's got a dose of adrenaline, he's going to be here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And I thought, great, everything's organised, this is fantastic. And this was Saturday, the 31st of May, 2014. So I went down to the yacht club that morning about 6 o'clock, and I was absolutely amazed by what I saw down there. We'd done media through the week, Oscar and I, and it was along the lines of, there's never going to be another first person to set foot on the moon. There's never going to be another first person to summit Everest. There's never going to be another first person to reach the South Pole. And there's never going to be another first person to row all the way across the Pacific. If you want to be part of this history, you're going to be down there. And there were thousands and thousands of people through the day on all the vantage points around the coast. And the other thing was there was hundreds and hundreds of Russian people that had come from all over Australia and New Zealand, a lot of them in their traditional Russian clothing, and a lot of them carrying loaves of bread and cakes, which were traditional gifts for a visiting priest. So they created a lot of atmosphere down there. But we'd also sent out media releases to the media. We hadn't really got a response. We didn't know what sort of media presence there would be. But there was about 15 camera crews there. There was 4 outside broadcasting vans. There was 3 helicopters in the sky. Media everywhere. And it was just phenomenal and great fun. We had a local radio station broadcasting live from the yacht club, which was handy. I'd arranged for the yacht club to open early because needed a decent coffee. But the first 2 hours of that morning were absolutely frantic. I was on the phone all the time, organising things. I put about 10 of those media crews onto the Coast Guard boat and sent them out to follow him in. I let the helicopters know his coordinates so they could go out and get footage. And it was absolutely frantic until about 8 o'clock when everything calmed down and everything was organised. And then Oscar phoned me, and he was out in what we refer to as a tinny in Australia. It's a 4 metre, I'll say aluminium open boat with an outboard on the back of it. And he had that 3-person Russian film crew with him. And unfortunately, those 3 people were chronically seasick. I felt so sorry for them. I mean, the weather conditions had changed. The swell had come up. It was really choppy out there. And Oscar said, Jeff, it's not going to be 9 o'clock. It's more likely going to be 11 o'clock. Doesn't matter. A little bit later, he rang and said, Jeff, it's not going to be 11 o'clock. Might be 1 o'clock. Doesn't matter. Jeff, it's not going to be 1 o'clock. It's going to be when we get there. And so I was able to let the radio station know, to let everyone else around the place know. So it didn't really matter. And everything was going lovely and smoothly until it didn't. Just after lunch, Oscar phoned me and he said, Jeff, we've just been told that your customs and immigration people are going to charge $1,100 to inspect the boat. We don't have this in our budget. Can you help? Now, customs immigration is federal government. I'm local government. Had nothing to do with me. But I said, I'll see what I can do. And a couple of minutes later, the Russian ambassador, who was a very tall, thin, gangly guy, all arms and legs, in a suit that was at least 2 or 3 sizes too big for him, came storming across the yacht club and to me, and he said, Jeff, I've just been told that your customs immigration people are going to charge you. And I said, yes, Mr. Ambassador, I know. Just chill. I'm working on it. Just go back and have another coffee. I'd made the mistake of putting a tab on the bar for VIPs for coffee. He'd taken full advantage of this. He was on his 6 double espresso, absolutely wide. We were just lucky he didn't have any nuclear launch codes or anything. God. People later said to me, you told the Russian ambassador to chill. And I thought, well, that's the end of my diplomatic career. But there was a guy there in customs uniform. So I went over and introduced myself and said, what's all this about? And he said that Mooloolaba isn't a designated arrival port into Australia. So he had to come up from Brisbane to do the paperwork and inspect the boat. So instead of being, and because this was a Saturday, penalty rates, overtime applied and everything. So instead of being normally cost less than $300, it was now going to cost more than $1,100. And I said, okay, so what exactly are you looking for? And he said, the usual sort of things, fresh fruit and vegetables. I said, he's been at sea for 160 days. Just how fresh do you think these will be? And he said, yes, I know, but I've got to go through the process. And I said, okay, well, what happens if he doesn't pay? And he said, well, he'll still be able to come ashore as long as his passport's in order, but we'll confiscate the boat and everything on it. And I thought, oh my, this has suddenly gone from a really good news story to a really bad news story. I knew how our media would concentrate. They'd concentrate on the negative part instead of the achievement. So I thought something had to be done. So I tried to ring my superiors at council, but because it was a Saturday afternoon, no one was answering their phone. I went and saw the Russian ambassador and said, can you help? And he said, but of course I cannot help. This is the Australian government. So, okay. So in the end, I made the decision that council would cover the cost of it on the basis that we'd try and get it waived. And a few days later, it was waived, which was good because it meant that I keep my job, which was great. But in a minute, I'll try and show you a video about the arrival. And in that, you'll see the customs official inspecting the boat and Oscar holding up the passport with a stamp in it with a big smile on his face. And that's what all this is about. But the plan was that he was going to come out from sea and arrive on the coast just on the edge of the right-hand edge of the screen here, on the beach there, and then we would transfer around to the back of the yacht club. But I'll explain that in a second. That's Steve Irwin's old boat, Whale One, there in the background. That's the custom guy on board the boat, looking for the fresh fruit and vegetables, and there's Oscar. Pretty happy about it. Have no idea how he could walk after 160 days on that boat. Just incredible. That purple hat he wears, that's his trademark hat. He always wears that. That's his grandson. Granddaughter. That's Oscar's wife. So you can see it was a bit of a scrum down there. It was a really good atmosphere down there. Wonderful time. And Lee and I thought we'd let the family have some time together, and we went off back to the yacht club. Now, he was 63 years old at the time. It took 159 days, 14 hours, setting a record for it. The longest solo man-powered voyage in history, 9,400 nautical miles. Each of those oars had a counter on it, and each oar did more than just over 1.31 million oar strokes as he crossed the Pacific. Just incredible. That's the way he used to sleep, just lay back and get a few minutes of sleep every now and again. Now, as I said, he was going to come in, and he landed right on the area here, and across the road is the yacht club. So Oscar and I had come up with a plan where he would, once we got to the land, he would get back in the boat, he'd be towed around to the back of the yacht club, we would have a welcoming ceremony there, then we'd have a press conference. So Lee and I went back over the yacht club. We were sitting at the back of the yacht club there having a celebratory drink, looking out over the yachts, and we saw the boat being brought around, and this reporter came out and he said, "Are you going to start the press conference?" And I said, "Yeah, as soon as he gets here." And I was pointing to the boat, and he said, "He's here, he's at the bar having a cup of tea." Now, that plan Oscar and I had come up with was a good plan, but if you really wanted to be a Monday morning quarterback and give it minor flaw in the plan, was that we hadn't actually told Fedor about it, and he wasn't all that keen to get back in the boat again and be towed around. So Oscar told him to just go across the road to the yacht club, ask for Jeff. Oscar hadn't been at the yacht club. He'd been out on that boat. He didn't know how busy it was. He said, "Go across the yacht club, ask for Jeff. Jeff will take care of you." And Oscar jumped in the boat, and he was being towed around, and I didn't know. So Fedor came across the road. Somehow he missed the front entrance to the yacht club, which is hard to do, and he'd come through the side entrance, and it was packed. He hadn't seen anyone for 160 days. He was a bit shocked, so he went up to the bar. He doesn't speak English at all, so he just said, "Tea, tea." And he was sitting there having a cup of tea. Now, the bar staff didn't know who he was. He kept on saying to them, "Jeff, Jeff," and they had no idea what he was talking about. They thought he was a vagrant. I mean, you can see the way they look, or a grotty yachty. You can see the way he looked. He didn't smell much better, I can tell you. He couldn't move from the bar because he didn't have any money to pay for the cup of tea. So we went up, Lee and I went up and we met him. Lee went down and got Oscar and brought him up, and we met him for the first time. We went down and had a ceremony down on the dock. We presented him with a quintessential gift from the Sunshine Coast, which was a surfboard with a picture of where he landed and a bit of an inscription about his journey. And he turned around and surprised everyone by taking off one of those carbon fibre oars that he'd rowed across from, and he presented that to the people of the Sunshine Coast, which was lovely. Now, a few days later, on the Tuesday, I think, the mayor rang me. He'd been away overseas on a trade mission. Sorry, no, Mayor's a great guy. This is the Mayor of the Sunshine Coast, wonderful guy. The Olympics are coming to the Sunshine Coast in Brisbane in 2032, and that's the man responsible for doing that. So I've got a lot of respect for him. But he said, Jeff, I'd love to meet this guy. Can you arrange it? So once again, we went back to the yacht club. I took the oar down, Fedor autographed it and dated it, which was great. And he and the Mayor got on very well. And through Oscar, he said to the Mayor, would it be possible to erect a plaque where I landed? And we'll come back in 12 months' time to unveil that plaque. And the Mayor looked at me and he said, I think that's a great idea, which is political speak for Jeff, you organise it. So 12 months later, they were back on the coast to unveil that plaque. And it's on a nice walkway where hundreds of people every day cycle or walk or run past it. It's a great feature there. But we were talking before about Antarctica. Now, 18 months before I'd ever heard of Fedor Konyakov, a young lady by the name of Lisa Blair came to see me. She was only in her teens at the time, early 20s. And she said that she wanted to be the very first female to circumnavigate Antarctica and that she wanted to break this Russian's record for doing so. And I put her in contact with a few potential sponsors and things, and she was able to buy a boat, and she was in Sydney doing some training. And I realised that this was, when I did the research into Fedor, I realised that this was the guy that Lisa was talking about. So I rang her and said, Fedor Konyakov, is that who you were talking about? She said, yes. And I said, well, he's rowing to the Sunshine Coast. You should come up and meet him. So she did, and I introduced him at the yacht club, and she said to them outright, I intend to break your record. And Fedor and Oscar took her upstairs in the yacht club, and they spent hours over the next few days with her going through charts and equipment lists and sales selection things and helped her out. And in May 2017, she set sail on her attempt to circumnavigate Antarctica. She was going very, very well for about 6 weeks, and then she got smashed by this huge storm. The boat actually capsized on 3 occasions. The keel was up in the air, the mast was pointing straight down to Davy Jones' locker before it righted itself. Now this was thousands and thousands of miles away from any sort of support or rescue at all, but when the boat righted itself, she just cleaned herself up and kept on going. But then she got smashed by another storm, and this time she lost her mast, so she had to motor into Cape Town to get repaired. But she completed it, but it wasn't unsupported non-stop. So last year, she set off again, and this time she made it. She broke the Fedor's record, by 10 days, and she told us later that Fedor and Oscar were the first people to give her a call and congratulate her. We actually had her on a Viking ship in Sydney a few months ago, and we're hoping to get her back next year. If you're on a cruise in Australia and New Zealand next year, she might be a guest speaker. But it was just a good effort. Now, when they were back on the coast for that unveiling of the plaque, when that was all finished, the three of us, Fedor, Oscar and I, went and had a coffee, and just to make conversation, I jokingly said, so what's the next big adventure? Thinking they would be, 64 years old, there's not going to be anything else. They looked at each other and they smiled. When he landed 12 months before, he had never been in a hot air balloon. 12 months later, he had a pilot's license for a hot air balloon. And he intended to break the great American Steve Fossett's record for circumnavigation of the world in a hot air balloon. Now, this is something that Richard Branson had attempted on 6 occasions and failed. Fossett had tried 6 times before he succeeded, but Fedor took off on the 12th of July from near Perth in Western Australia, and he actually got all the way around on his first attempt, breaking the world record by just over 3 days. And then a couple of weeks later, he took another balloon, and he went up, set another world record for going for altitude in a hot air balloon, going 21 kilometres above the Earth into the stratosphere, into space. And then a few days later, he went up again, and this time he set another world record for time spent in space in a non-mechanicalised spacecraft, 55 hours. Just incredible. Now, back in 2017, I got a phone call from Oscar, and he said, Jeff, "Are you and Leanne in England?" And I said, "No, we're actually in Cyprus. Why?" And he said, "Well, Fedora and I are going to England to inspect progress on the new boat. It would have been great to be able to catch up." I said, "Hang on, back up. What new boat? What are you talking about?" So they were building another boat that he intended to row all the way around the world in, and he was going to do it in 3 stages. So he set off in February 2019 from New Zealand, South Island of New Zealand, Dunedin I think it was, and he was travelling all the way across that Southern Ocean. Now at the time we were on a Viking ship going the other way, and we would look out over the horizon and think that few thousand miles down that way is Fedora. But on that trip, he got smashed not by 1 or 2, but by 3 massive cyclones. And some days you'd log into his progress and he'd gone back 60 miles. And on that 3rd cyclone, it was so severe, it lasted for 3 days, he actually had to strap himself into the sleeping canopy there, and he had very little food and water for those 3 days. He said it was like being tossed around like a cork in a washing machine. It was so severe. And when the storm abated, you can see where the solar panels had been on the back of the boat there. Now those solar panels had been stuck down with marine grade glue and also screwed down as well. But the force had ripped those solar panels off, which was pretty serious because those solar panels powered the batteries, which powered the navigational and communication equipment, but also the little desalination plant, which produced water, fresh water. So he had to be very careful with that, but he made it. And then we got a phone call from Oscar in 2019 saying, "Jeff, are you and Leanne in England?" And I said, "Yes, we are. Why?" And he said, "Well, we're going to Bristol to inspect progress on the new balloon. It would be great to catch up." And I said, "Hang on a minute. What new balloon?" And this will give you some idea of the scale of the balloon. It's the world's largest hot air balloon, bigger than a space shuttle. It's been built by Cameron Balloons in Bristol. And the idea was this Indian chap had beaten his world altitude record. This Indian had gone 25 kilometres above the Earth. Fedora wanted his record back. So he was going to take off from northern and Western Australia to try and get that record back. Unfortunately, COVID intervened, and then since then we've had the issues with Ukraine. So that balloon is still waiting for him in Western Australia until things settle down. And this is us at Cameron Balloons there. This is the capsule that he was going to spend time in, and it's just so basic. There's a plastic chair inside there with a little seat belt over it, and the controls, they're nothing technical about it at all. They're just a bicycle pedals. So it drives a chain, you pedal it one way to open up the vents, you pedal it the other way to close the vents off. That's all there is. It's just so basic. He had to go through cosmonaut training to be able to attempt it. And this is Don Cameron, who's the godfather, doyen of balloon manufacturing around the world. And we were in this little office at Cameron Balloons, and Don got up and he was talking, and he said, I think I can make a balloon that can stay up long enough for you to circumnavigate the world twice, which is something that's never been attempted before. And so we're just waiting for that to happen at the moment as well. Earlier this year, he set some world records for balloon flights over the Arctic with the Northern Lights there, which looks absolutely fantastic. Now, people ask about his wife, Irina. She is actually, how does she put up with him with all this? She is actually a very, very celebrated woman in her own right, very intelligent woman. She's also a bit of an adventure, because one of those other things I didn't get a chance to tell you about is that they rowed across the Atlantic together, and they currently hold the world record for a husband and wife rowing across the Atlantic. People ask why he does it. Is it for fame? Well, obviously not. No one's ever heard of him. I've done this talk a lot of times now, and no one has ever heard of him outside of Russia. Is it for fortune? No. All these ventures are sponsored. He's got to account for every cent. He doesn't stay in 5-star hotels. He lives a very, very modest lifestyle. If you ask him, he'll tell you it's because of the challenge. He just loves the challenge, and he thinks what he does is appreciated by his God and his family. Just a wonderful guy. So while we were there at Cameron Balloons, we all went off to lunch together, and Oscar said, Jeff, we want to talk to you about another project. And I thought, another? And he said, no, not for us, for you. And he said, we want you to write his biography, Fedor's biography. And I was really surprised, and I said, well, I've never written a book. And he said, we know that, but you know us, we know you, we think you'd be the best person to do it. So we changed things around. We were going to go to Moscow for 2 months from September 2020, but because of COVID, we couldn't go. Because of what's happened now, we can't go. But hopefully someday we'll see each other on the high seas on a Viking ship again, and I'll be able to autograph a New York Times best-selling book about the life of Fedor Konyakov. So as I said, this is very subjective. I don't know whether you think he's the world's greatest adventurer at all, but you'd have to appreciate that he's an incredible man, and I'm very proud to call them my friends. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow.